Tonight, we're taking you to the filthiest, most disgusting city in medieval Europe. A place where the smell alone could knock you unconscious, where walking down the street meant stepping through human waste, rotting meat, and things far worse. This is 14th century London, and you wouldn't survive 5 minutes without gagging. Before we dive into this stomach-churning story, I'm curious, where are you watching this right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. Are you in a clean, comfortable space? Maybe your bedroom, living room, or somewhere with fresh air? I love hearing from all corners of the world. And if this horrifying tale of medieval hygiene makes you appreciate modern sanitation, please hit that like button and subscribe for more shocking true stories from history. Your support means everything and helps me bring you these incredible historical revelations. So settle in, maybe light a candle for some pleasant scent, and let me tell you why medieval London was basically an open sewer with buildings. What you're about to hear will make you grateful for every flush toilet, every garbage truck, and every sewage treatment plant in existence. This isn't just about a dirty city. This is about humanity at its absolute filthiest. And somehow, people not only survived, but thrived in conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors. Picture this. You've just stepped off a merchant's wagon at the outskirts of 14th century London. The year is 1348, and you're approaching what's supposed to be one of Europe's greatest cities, home to nearly 100,000 souls packed into a space barely 3 miles across. But before you can even see the famous stone walls, or catch a glimpse of the Tower of London rising in the distance, something hits you like a physical blow. The smell. It's not just one odour, but a symphony of stenches so overwhelming, so absolutely revolting, that your eyes water and your stomach lurches. This isn't the mild unpleasantness of a garbage day gone wrong or a backed-up drain. This is an assault on your senses so complete that visitors from other medieval cities, places that weren't exactly known for their cleanliness, would literally cover their faces and gag upon approaching London's gates. What exactly are you smelling? Let's break down this olfactory nightmare piece by piece, because understanding the components of medieval London's stench is key to grasping just how unlivable this place really was. First, there's the overwhelming odour of human waste. Not just the occasional whiff you might catch near a poorly maintained public restroom, but the concentrated, accumulated reek of 100,000 people's bodily functions, most of which never made it to anything resembling proper disposal. In medieval London, the concept of sewage treatment was as foreign as space travel. People relieved themselves wherever was convenient, and that waste stayed right where it landed. The lucky residents had access to communal latrines, wooden structures built over pits, or if they were extremely fortunate, overflowing water. But these facilities were few and far between, serving dozens or even hundreds of people each. The pits beneath them were rarely cleaned, often overflowing and located right in the heart of residential areas. The waste would seep into the ground, contaminating wells and making the earth itself toxic. But most Londoners didn't even have access to these primitive facilities. They used chamber pots in their homes, clay or wooden vessels that were emptied by simply opening a window and dumping the contents into the street below. This practice was so common that there was actually a legal requirement to shout "Gardez-loo" before emptying your chamber pot, warning anyone walking below to take cover. The French phrase "garde à l'eau," watch out for the water, had been corrupted into this cheerful warning that excrement was about to rain from the sky. The streets themselves became open sewers, with human waste flowing down the middle in what were euphemistically called kennels. Channels that were supposed to carry rainwater, but instead carried a horrifying mixture of urine, feces, and whatever else people chose to dispose of. During dry periods, this waste would cake and harden, creating a crusty, reeking surface that would turn to toxic soup with the next rainfall. But human waste was just the beginning of London's aromatic horrors. The city was home to countless animals, not just the horses and oxen used for transportation and labour, but pigs, chickens, goats, and even cattle that roamed the streets freely. These animals contributed their own substantial quantities of excrement to the urban landscape, and their waste mixed with human refuse to create a fermented nightmare that coated the streets in a thick, slippery layer of biological horror. The smell of rotting meat was another constant presence in London's atmosphere. The city's butchers worked in the open air, slaughtering animals right in the streets or in courtyards that were barely separated from public thoroughfares. They would dump the offal, intestines, organs, blood, and scraps of flesh directly onto the ground, expecting scavenging animals to clean up the mess. But the animals couldn't keep up with the constant supply of rotting organic matter, and the streets became littered with decomposing animal parts that baked in the sun and festered in the rain. The Thames, London's lifeline, had become an open sewer of epic proportions. This was the same river that supplied drinking water to much of the city, but it was also where people dumped their waste, where dead animals were thrown, where the runoff from the filthy streets eventually flowed. The river's banks were lined with public latrines that emptied directly into the water, and the tides would wash human waste back and forth, sometimes depositing it on the shores where children played and vendors sold food. Industrial activities added their own special contributions to London's bouquet of horrors. Tanners used urine and animal dung to cure leather, creating a stench so powerful that tanneries were supposed to be located downwind of residential areas, though this rule was frequently ignored. The process of making leather involved soaking animal hides in vats of putrefying organic matter for weeks or months, and the resulting odour could be detected from miles away. Brewers, bakers, and other food producers dumped their waste wherever was convenient, often right outside their shops. Spoiled grain, rotten vegetables, and failed batches of ale created puddles of fermented organic matter that attracted swarms of flies and rats. The flies weren't just a nuisance, they were vectors of disease, carrying contamination from the waste to the food being prepared and sold just feet away. Even the wealthy couldn't escape the stench, though they tried their best. Rich merchants and nobles carried small bouquets of flowers or herbs called nosegays to hold under their noses when venturing outside. They burned expensive incense in their homes and wore sachets of aromatic herbs sewn into their clothing. But these measures provided only minimal relief against the overwhelming assault of odours that permeated every corner of the city. The poor, who made up the vast majority of London's population, had no such luxuries. They lived directly above shops where animal fat was rendered into soap, where fish was preserved in salt, where any number of noxious industrial processes took place. Their homes were often single rooms, shared by entire families, with no windows for ventilation and no way to escape the smells that seemed to seep through the very walls. Religious authorities tried to maintain that cleanliness was next to godliness, but the reality on the ground made this ideal impossible to achieve. Churches and monasteries were marginally cleaner than the surrounding neighbourhoods, but even these holy places couldn't entirely escape the pervasive stench that had become as much a part of London as the Thames itself. Visitors from other countries were consistently shocked by London's filthiness. A French diplomat wrote that the city's smell was more foul than any battlefield after 3 days of summer heat. A German merchant recorded that he could smell London from several miles away, and initially thought there must be a massive fire consuming rotting matter somewhere ahead. But perhaps most telling were the comments of visitors from other English cities. York, Bristol, and even smaller towns that we would consider primitive by modern standards, all sent emissaries to London who complained bitterly about the capital's uncleanliness. If medieval provincial towns found London disgusting, you can imagine just how awful the conditions really were. The stench wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. Medieval people understood that bad air could cause illness. even if they didn't understand the actual mechanisms of disease transmission. They believed in the theory of miasma, the idea that disease was spread through foul-smelling air. While they were wrong about the specifics, they weren't wrong about the correlation between filthy conditions and sickness. The irony is that London's residents had become so accustomed to the smell that many of them barely noticed it anymore. Humans have a remarkable ability to adapt to even the most horrific sensory conditions, and Londoners had developed what we might call nose blindness to their city's reek. They went about their daily business, buying bread, conducting trade, raising families, while wading through conditions that would send a modern person fleeing in horror. Children born in London knew no other reality. They played in streets ankle-deep in waste, drank water that tasted of sewage, and breathed air so thick with the stench of decay that it seemed almost solid. To them, this wasn't a hellish nightmare. It was simply life. They had no frame of reference for cleanliness, no understanding that cities could smell like anything other than a massive, open latrine. This normalization of filth created a vicious cycle. Because people accepted these conditions as natural and inevitable, there was little pressure for improvement. City officials, who lived in the same stench as everyone else, saw no urgent need for sanitation reforms. The few voices calling for cleaner streets were dismissed as impractical dreamers who didn't understand the realities of urban life. As you stand at the gates of medieval London, taking in that first devastating whiff of the city's signature scent, you're getting your first lesson in what daily life was really like for our ancestors. This wasn't a brief, unpleasant experience you could walk away from. This was the baseline condition of existence for hundreds of thousands of people who had no choice but to live, work, and die in the most revolting urban environment humans have ever created. And the smell? That was just the beginning of London's problems. Now that your nose has been thoroughly assaulted by London's signature bouquet, let's actually venture into the city and see what walking through medieval London's streets was really like. Spoiler alert, if you thought the smell was bad, wait until you discover what you'd be walking through, stepping on, and occasionally slipping in as you made your way through this urban nightmare. The streets of medieval London weren't paved in the modern sense. The main thoroughfares might have some rough cobblestones laid down, but these were irregular, poorly maintained, and separated by wide gaps that collected every imaginable form of filth. The secondary streets and alleyways, where most people actually lived and worked, were nothing more than packed earth that had been churned into a permanent state of muddy contamination by the passage of countless feet, hooves, and cartwheels. During dry periods, the streets became a hardened, crusty surface that was deceptively solid-looking, but actually composed of years' worth of accumulated human and animal waste, rotting organic matter, and decomposed garbage that had been baked by the sun and compacted by traffic. Walking on this surface was like walking on a vast sheet of biological concrete, and every step would send up small puffs of dust that contained particles you absolutely didn't want to think about inhaling. But dry periods were the good times. When it rained, which it did frequently in London's notoriously wet climate, these streets transformed into something far worse than simple mud. The accumulated waste would soften and liquefy, creating a brown, lumpy soup that could be anywhere from ankle-deep to knee-deep, depending on the drainage and the amount of recent precipitation. This wasn't just dirty water we're talking about. This was a toxic brew that contained human feces and urine from thousands of people, animal waste from the countless creatures that lived and worked in the city, rotting food scraps, dead animals in various stages of decomposition, industrial waste from workshops and tanneries, and anything else that people found convenient to throw into the streets. The kennels, the channels that ran down the middle of most streets, were supposed to carry this liquid waste away from residential areas. But the system was primitive at best and completely overwhelmed at worst. These channels had no proper engineering behind them. They followed the natural slope of the land, which meant they often flowed directly past front doors, under overhanging buildings, and through the busiest commercial areas. When the channels became clogged, which happened constantly due to the sheer volume of solid waste being thrown into them, the street would flood with sewage that had nowhere to go. Imagine trying to navigate around a backed-up storm drain in modern times, then multiply that image by 1,000, and add the fact that medieval London had no municipal clean-up crews, no emergency services, and no one with the authority or inclination to fix the problem quickly. Walking through these flooded streets required a specific set of skills that modern people simply don't possess. Londoners developed a peculiar gait that involved lifting their feet high with each step to avoid getting stuck in the muck, testing each footfall before putting their full weight down, and constantly scanning the ground ahead for obstacles, holes, or particularly deep accumulations of waste. The wealthy had some options for avoiding the worst of the street conditions. They could afford to wear tall leather boots that came up to their knees, providing some protection from the filth. Some wealthy merchants and nobles employed servants whose sole job was to walk ahead of them with long poles, testing the depth of the muck and finding the least contaminated route through the streets. The ultimate luxury was being carried in a litter, essentially a chair or small cabin mounted on poles and carried by servants that kept you entirely above the street level. But even this solution had its drawbacks, as the carriers still had to wade through the filth, and the rocking motion of the litter, combined with the overwhelming stench, often left passengers violently sick to their stomachs. For the common people, who made up the vast majority of London's population, there were no such options. They wore simple leather shoes that provided no protection whatsoever against the liquid filth of the streets. Their clothing would be perpetually stained and contaminated from the knees down, and the smell of the streets would be ground into the fabric so thoroughly that it could never be completely washed out. Children faced particular challenges navigating London's streets. Their shorter stature meant that what was ankle-deep muck for an adult could be knee-deep or even waist-deep for a child. Many children learned to swim before they learned to walk properly, not in clean rivers or ponds, but in the sewage-filled puddles and flooded streets of their neighbourhoods. The mortality rate among children in London was astronomical, and much of it can be attributed to the constant exposure to contaminated conditions. Children would fall into street puddles and emerge covered in waste that contained every disease-causing organism imaginable. They would play with objects they found in the muck, put contaminated hands in their mouths, and breathe air that was thick with bacteria and parasites. Street vendors had to find creative solutions for conducting business in these conditions. Food sellers would set up platforms or tables to keep their wares above the level of the street. But contamination was still a constant problem. Bread vendors would cover their loaves with cloth, but the cloth itself would quickly become contaminated by the airborne particles and spray from passing traffic. The term street food takes on an entirely different meaning when you consider that the streets themselves were essentially open sewers. Any food prepared or sold at street level was almost guaranteed to be contaminated with fecal matter. And food safety was a concept that simply didn't exist. People ate contaminated food because there was no other option, and they developed a tolerance for mild food poisoning that would hospitalize a modern person. Transportation through the streets was its own special nightmare. Horses and oxen would sink into the muck up to their knees, and pulling a loaded cart through the streets required enormous effort. The animals would urinate and defecate as they worked, adding their contributions to the already horrific conditions underfoot. Cartwheels would become clogged with the sticky, contaminated mud, requiring frequent stops to clear them. The wheels would also splash the liquid filth in all directions as they turned, showering anyone nearby with waste. Walking behind a cart was particularly hazardous, as the wheels would kick up a continuous spray of contaminated material. During winter, the situation became even more complex. The waste-filled streets would freeze into a treacherous surface that was both slippery and contaminated. People would slip and fall directly into frozen sewage, and the ice would often conceal deep puddles of liquid waste that would soak anyone unlucky enough to break through. The spring thaw was perhaps the most horrific time of all. Months' worth of accumulated waste that had been frozen and relatively stable would suddenly liquefy all at once, creating floods of contaminated water that could reach the first-floor windows of buildings in low-lying areas. The smell during spring thaw was so overwhelming that many people simply stayed indoors until the worst of it had drained away. Street cleaning, to the extent that it existed at all, was performed by the city's population of stray animals. Pigs, dogs, and even rats served as unofficial sanitation workers, eating whatever organic waste they could find. But these animals also contributed their own waste to the streets, and they often died from eating contaminated material, adding their decomposing bodies to the general horror. The few attempts at organised street cleaning were primitive and ineffective. Some neighbourhoods employed rakers, people whose job was to scrape the worst accumulations of waste off the streets and cart it away. But there was nowhere to cart it to except other parts of the city, so this really just moved the problem around rather than solving it. The psychological impact of living in these conditions was severe. People became resigned to perpetual filthiness, accepting that their feet, legs, and clothing would always be contaminated. The concept of clean became relative. Something was clean if it was merely dirty rather than revolting. Modern people visiting medieval London would be completely unprepared for the physical demands of simply moving through the city. The constant vigilance required to avoid the worst contamination, the physical effort of walking through the muck, and the mental stress of being surrounded by such horrific conditions would be exhausting within hours. Yet somehow, life went on. People fell in love, conducted business, created art, and built families while wading through conditions that would be considered uninhabitable by modern standards. The human capacity for adaptation to even the most horrific circumstances is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of medieval London's story. But as bad as the streets were, they were just the foundation for an even more complex web of urban horror that touched every aspect of daily life in the medieval city. If London's streets were horrific, the Thames, the city's main source of water and its primary highway for commerce, was an aquatic nightmare that defied comprehension. This wasn't just a polluted river, it was a flowing toilet that served nearly 100,000 people, a liquid graveyard for the city's waste, and somehow, impossibly, the same body of water that people depended on for drinking, cooking, and washing. Let's start with the most fundamental horror. The Thames was London's largest public latrine. Dozens of public toilets were built directly over the river, constructed as wooden platforms that extended out from the banks with holes cut in the floor. When you used one of these facilities, your waste dropped directly into the water below, where it would be carried away by the current, or during low tide, where it would sit, festering in the mud, until the next high tide. But these public facilities served only a small fraction of the population. Most Londoners simply relieved themselves wherever was convenient along the riverbank, or dumped their chamber pots directly into the water. The result was that the Thames carried a constant flow of human waste downstream, creating a brown, stinking current that was visible from the bridges and banks. The tidal nature of the Thames made this situation even worse. Twice a day, the tide would reverse the river's flow, pushing the waste back upstream and depositing it along the banks where it would cake and harden in the sun. Children played along these banks. Vendors sold food from stalls just yards from the accumulated sewage, and people drew water for cooking and drinking from the same contaminated source. Dead animals were another major component of the Thames's horrific ecosystem. When horses, cattle, pigs, or other livestock died in the city, the easiest disposal method was simply to drag them to the river and push them in. The current would carry the carcasses downstream, where they would eventually wash up on the banks in various stages of decomposition. But it wasn't just large animals that ended up in the Thames. The river was the final destination for countless cats, dogs, rats, and birds that died in the city. Butchers would throw the heads, hooves and organs of slaughtered animals directly into the water. Tanners would dump the rotting flesh they scraped from animal hides. Fishmongers would throw their spoiled catch back into the river. The result was a waterway that was more like a flowing soup of decomposing organic matter than anything resembling clean water. During hot weather, the decomposition process would accelerate, creating bubbles of methane gas that would break the surface with audible pops, releasing clouds of toxic vapor that could be smelled for miles. Industrial waste added another layer of toxicity to the Thames. Dye works would dump their chemical runoff into the river, turning the water strange colours that changed with the tide. Metal workers would rinse their tools and materials in the river, adding heavy metals and other toxic substances to the mix. Soap makers would dump their lye and animal fat waste directly into the water. Perhaps most horrifically, the Thames was also where human corpses ended up. When people died in London, whether from disease, violence, or accident, the bodies were supposed to be buried in churchyards. But the churchyards were overcrowded, burial was expensive, and sometimes families simply couldn't afford proper interment. Bodies would be dumped into the river under cover of darkness, adding human decomposition to the already nightmarish brew. During plague years, when deaths overwhelmed the city's ability to dispose of bodies properly, the Thames would become clogged with human corpses. Contemporary accounts describe the river as being so thick with bodies that you could almost walk across it on the backs of the dead. The smell during these periods was so overwhelming that people would flee the city entirely if they had anywhere else to go. Yet this same water was what Londoners used for virtually every aspect of daily life. Water carriers would fill barrels directly from the Thames and sell it to households throughout the city. Brewers would use river water to make ale and beer. Bakers would use it for bread. Laundresses would wash clothing in the contaminated water, somehow believing they were cleaning things. The wealthy had some options for obtaining cleaner water. They could afford to dig wells, though these were often contaminated by the waste that seeped into the groundwater from the streets above. Some wealthy households employed servants whose job was to travel outside the city to collect water from supposedly cleaner sources, though even these were often contaminated by upstream pollution. The process of drawing water from the Thames was itself a hazardous undertaking. Water carriers would wade into the river with buckets, trying to find spots where the water looked slightly less contaminated than usual. They would filter the water through cloth to remove the largest chunks of waste and debris. But this primitive filtration did nothing to address the bacterial and chemical contamination that made the water deadly. During low tide, the banks of the Thames would be exposed, revealing a moonscape of accumulated waste that had been deposited over the centuries. This wasn't just recent waste. Some of the deposits represented decades or even centuries of accumulated sewage and debris. The smell from these exposed mudflats was so intense that it could induce vomiting in people who weren't accustomed to it. People would actually walk on these contaminated mudflats, either because they had no choice or because they were searching for objects of value that might have been washed up by the tide. Children would play in this toxic mud, building castles and digging holes in material that was essentially concentrated sewage. The Thames was also London's main transportation artery, which meant that boats and barges were constantly moving through the contaminated water. Boatmen would pole their vessels through water that was thick with waste, and passengers would have to breathe air that was heavy with the stench of decomposition. The boats themselves would become contaminated, and anyone who touched the sides or fell into the water would be exposed to every disease organism in the city. Fish still lived in the Thames, though they were hardly what you'd call healthy specimens. These fish survived by eating the waste and decomposing matter that flowed into the river, making them walking or swimming but disease vectors. Yet people still caught and ate these fish, either because they were desperate for protein or because they simply didn't understand the connection between the fish's contaminated environment and their potential danger as food. The fishing industry in London was actually built around catching these contaminated fish and selling them to the poor, who couldn't afford better food sources. Fish vendors would set up stalls right along the riverbank, selling their catch just yards from where they had pulled it out of the sewage-filled water. The irony that they were essentially selling concentrated disease was lost on both the vendors and their customers. Bridge construction added another dimension to the Thames's problems. London Bridge, the city's main river crossing, was built with multiple piers that restricted the flow of water and created areas where waste would accumulate and stagnate. The bridge also had buildings constructed on it, including houses, shops, and public latrines that discharged directly into the river below. The restricted flow meant that waste would back up behind the bridge piers, creating putrid pools that would ferment in the sun. During low tide, these pools would be exposed as stinking lagoons of concentrated sewage that could be smelled throughout the city. The bridge itself became a source of contamination, as people would throw garbage and waste directly off the sides into the water below. Religious authorities tried to address the Thames's contamination through prayer and ritual rather than practical measures. They would bless the water, perform ceremonies to purify it spiritually, and declare certain sections of the river to be holy. But no amount of religious intervention could address the fundamental problem that the Thames had become a flowing toilet for an entire city. The impact on public health was catastrophic. Waterborne diseases like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery were endemic in London, spreading through the contaminated water supply and killing thousands every year. People would drink contaminated water in the morning and be dead by evening, though they rarely made the connection between their water source and their illness. Perhaps most tragically, the Thames had once been a beautiful, clean river, teeming with fish and supporting vibrant ecosystems. Medieval accounts from centuries earlier describe clear water, abundant wildlife, and riverside areas that were pleasant places to spend time. The transformation of this natural resource into a flowing nightmare represents one of the most complete environmental disasters in human history. Yet Londoners had no choice but to continue depending on the Thames. It was their only source of water, their main transportation route, and their primary method of waste disposal. They had created a system that was unsustainable and deadly, but they were trapped within it by the very conditions they had created. The Thames wasn't just polluted, it was a liquid representation of everything that was wrong with medieval urban life, flowing through the heart of the city as a constant reminder that humans had created an environment that was fundamentally hostile to human survival. If the streets were horrific and the Thames was deadly, the very air that Londoners breathed was perhaps the most insidious killer of all. This wasn't just unpleasant smelling air. This was atmosphere so thick with toxic particles, disease-causing organisms, and poisonous gases that every breath was literally shortening your life. Modern people, accustomed to air that might smell of car exhaust or industrial pollution, would find medieval London's air absolutely unbreathable. Let's start with the most obvious component, the constant smoke that hung over the city like a permanent brown fog. Medieval London was powered by fire, fires for cooking, fires for heating, fires for industrial processes, fires for light. But unlike modern combustion, which at least attempts to burn fuel cleanly, medieval fires were inefficient. Smoky affairs that pumped enormous quantities of particulates into the air. Every home, workshop, and business had its own fire burning throughout most of the day and night. These fires burned wood when it was available, but more often they burned whatever combustible material people could find. Animal dung, rotting vegetables, old clothing, scraps of leather, and even human hair. The smoke from these fires was thick, black, and filled with toxic compounds that would settle in people's lungs and stay there. But the domestic fires were just the beginning. London was home to numerous industries that produced their own special varieties of toxic smoke. Metalworkers burned coal and charcoal at extremely high temperatures, producing smoke filled with heavy metals and sulfur compounds. The smell of these forges could be detected miles away, and the workers who operated them often died young from lung diseases that we now know were caused by breathing metal particles and toxic gases. Tanners were perhaps the worst offenders when it came to air pollution. The process of turning animal hides into leather involved burning various organic materials to produce the chemicals needed for tanning. They would burn animal hair, hooves, bones, and organs, creating smoke that was not just foul-smelling but actively toxic. The particulates from tanning fires contain not just the usual combustion products, but also the decomposition products of rotting animal matter. Soap makers added their own contribution to London's toxic atmosphere. The process of making soap required burning animal fat at high temperatures, which produced smoke filled with fatty acids and other organic compounds. The smell was rancid and overwhelming, and the smoke would leave a greasy residue on everything it touched, including people's lungs. But perhaps the most dangerous air pollution came from the city's numerous lime kilns. Lime was essential for construction and various industrial processes, and producing it required burning limestone at extremely high temperatures. This process released enormous quantities of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other toxic gases into the atmosphere. The lime kilns operated day and night, pumping a steady stream of poisonous gases into the air that Londoners had no choice but to breathe. The cumulative effect of all this smoke and industrial pollution was an atmosphere that was literally toxic. The air was so thick with particulates that visibility was often limited to just a few hundred yards, even on clear days. The smoke would settle on buildings, creating a black coating that would build up over the years until entire neighbourhoods looked like they had been painted with soot. But smoke was only part of the problem. The air was also thick with the gaseous products of decomposition from all the organic waste that littered the city. Human and animal waste, rotting food, decomposing corpses, and industrial organic waste all produced methane, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and other toxic gases as they decomposed. These gases would hang in the air, especially during calm weather, creating a toxic soup that people had to breathe every moment of their lives. The smell alone was enough to make visitors sick, but the health effects went far beyond simple nausea. The toxic gases would irritate people's respiratory systems, causing chronic coughing, wheezing, and difficulty breathing. Over time, the constant exposure would lead to permanent lung damage, heart problems, and premature death. Children were particularly vulnerable to the toxic air. Their smaller bodies and developing respiratory systems couldn't handle the constant assault of poisonous gases and particles. Child mortality rates in London were astronomical, and much of this can be attributed to respiratory problems caused by breathing contaminated air from birth. The wealthy tried to protect themselves from the worst of the air pollution, but their options were limited. They could afford to burn cleaner fuels like high-quality wood or even imported coal, which produced less smoke than the refuse burned by the poor. They could construct their homes with better ventilation systems and taller chimneys that would carry some of the smoke away from their living spaces. Some wealthy Londoners employed servants whose job was to burn pleasant-smelling substances, herbs, flowers, and expensive incense to mask the worst odours in their homes. But these measures provided only marginal relief against the overwhelming atmospheric contamination that permeated the entire city. The poor, who made up the vast majority of London's population, had no protection whatsoever against the toxic air. They lived in single-room hovels with no ventilation, often located directly above or next to workshops that produced some of the worst industrial pollution. They breathed the most contaminated air during the day while working, and they breathed it at night while trying to sleep. Many Londoners developed chronic respiratory conditions that were simply accepted as normal parts of city life. Persistent coughing, wheezing, and shortness of breath were so common that they weren't even considered illnesses. They were just the price of living in the city. People would cough up black phlegm filled with soot and particles, and this was considered normal rather than alarming. The air pollution had effects beyond just respiratory health. The constant exposure to toxic gases would affect people's nervous systems, causing headaches, dizziness, and mental confusion. The heavy metals in the smoke would accumulate in people's bodies over time, leading to poisoning that would manifest as various mysterious ailments that medieval medicine was powerless to treat. Weather patterns made the air pollution even worse during certain times of the year. During the winter months, temperature inversions would trap the smoke and toxic gases close to the ground, creating periods when the air was literally unbreathable. People would be forced to stay indoors with wet cloths over their faces, but even this provided only minimal protection. During these pollution emergencies, the death rate in London would spike dramatically. The elderly, the sick, and children would simply suffocate from breathing air that was more toxic than breathable. But these deaths were attributed to mysterious plagues or seasonal illnesses rather than the obvious cause of air poisoning. The impact on daily life was profound. People had to plan their activities around the air quality, avoiding outdoor work during the worst pollution periods. Laundry hung outside to dry would become blackened with soot within hours. Food prepared outdoors would become contaminated with airborne particles. Even indoor activities were affected, as the smoke would seep through walls and windows, making every space contaminated. Religious authorities tried to address the air pollution through spiritual means, declaring that the foul air was a punishment from God for the city's sins. They organized prayer services and religious processions to purify the atmosphere, but these had no effect on the actual source of the contamination. The few voices calling for practical solutions to the air pollution problem were ignored or dismissed as impractical. The idea that the city's industrial activities might need to be regulated or moved outside the urban area was considered absurd. People accepted toxic air as an inevitable consequence of city life, much like they accepted contaminated water and filthy streets. Perhaps most tragically, many Londoners had never breathed clean air in their entire lives. They had no concept of what air was supposed to smell like, or how easy breathing should be. To them, the constant burning sensation in their lungs, the persistent cough, and the thick, choking atmosphere were simply normal aspects of existence. The psychological impact of breathing poison every day cannot be overstated. People became resigned to feeling constantly unwell, accepting headaches, nausea, and respiratory distress as unavoidable features of daily life. The very act of breathing, which should be automatic and unconscious, became a conscious struggle that required effort and endurance. Modern visitors to medieval London would likely suffer immediate respiratory distress upon breathing the city's air. The shock to lungs accustomed to relatively clean air would be overwhelming, potentially causing severe coughing fits, breathing difficulties, and possibly even respiratory failure. What took years to kill medieval Londoners might incapacitate a modern person within hours. Yet somehow, life continued. People fell in love, raised families, created art, and built communities while breathing air that was fundamentally hostile to human life. The human capacity to adapt to even the most toxic conditions is both remarkable and heartbreaking, demonstrating that people can normalize almost any level of suffering if they have no other choice. The air of medieval London wasn't just polluted, it was a weapon that the city turned against its own inhabitants, slowly poisoning everyone who lived there while remaining largely invisible as a cause of death and disease. In this toxic urban landscape of contaminated streets, poisoned water, and deadly air, the question of food becomes truly nightmarish. How do you feed 100,000 people in a city where every surface is contaminated, where the water supply is essentially sewage, and where the very air carries disease? The answer is very badly, with consequences that would horrify anyone with even a basic understanding of food safety. Let's start with the most fundamental problem. In medieval London, the line between food and garbage had become dangerously blurred. Food vendors operated directly on the filthy streets, setting up their stalls in the same spaces where people relieved themselves, animals defecated, and industrial waste accumulated. The concept of a clean food preparation area simply didn't exist. Bread, the staple food of medieval life, was particularly susceptible to contamination. Bakers would set up their ovens at street level, with the bread-making area open to the contaminated air. Flour would be stored in sacks that sat directly on floors that were essentially layers of compressed sewage. The water used to make bread came from the Thames, with all its horrific contamination. Even the fuel used to heat the ovens, often animal dung or refuse, would contribute smoke and particles that would settle on the bread as it baked. The bakers themselves were unwitting agents of contamination. They would handle the bread with hands that had never been properly washed, wearing clothes that were permanently stained with the filth of the streets. They would cough and sneeze over the dough, and their chronic respiratory infections, caused by breathing the city's toxic air, meant that every loaf was potentially contaminated with disease-causing organisms. But bread contamination was just the beginning. Meat vendors faced even worse challenges in maintaining any semblance of food safety. Animals were slaughtered right in the streets, often just yards from where people emptied their chamber pots. The blood from slaughtered animals would mix with human waste, creating a toxic soup that would splash onto nearby food stalls and vendors. Butchers had no refrigeration, no understanding of bacterial contamination, and no effective way to keep meat fresh in a city where the ambient temperature was often quite warm due to all the fires. Meat would be hung in the open air, exposed to the clouds of flies that fed on the waste-filled streets. These flies would land on rotting matter, then immediately land on the meat that people were going to eat, carrying disease organisms from the sewers directly to dinner tables. The sight of a medieval London meat market would be absolutely horrifying to modern eyes. Carcasses would hang in the open air for days or even weeks, slowly decomposing while customers bargained for pieces. The meat would often be green with decay, swarming with maggots, and emitting smells that would make a modern person violently ill. Yet this was considered normal, and people would simply cut away the most obviously rotten parts and eat the rest. Fish vendors faced similar challenges, but with the added horror that their product came directly from the Thames. Fish that had spent their lives swimming in sewage, feeding on human waste, and decomposing matter would be caught and sold as food with no understanding of the contamination involved. These fish were essentially swimming concentrations of every disease organism in the city, yet they were a major protein source for the poor. The fish markets were located right along the Thames, where vendors would gut and clean their catch just yards from where people were emptying their waste into the water. Fish entrails and scales would be thrown back into the river, adding to the contamination, while the cleaned fish would be laid out on wooden tables that had never been properly sanitized. Dairy products presented their own special horrors. Cows were kept right in the city, often in conditions that were even filthier than the streets. These animals would stand ankle deep in their own waste, eating garbage and contaminated fodder, while producing milk that was sold directly to consumers. The milking process would take place in contaminated environments with unwashed hands and dirty containers, ensuring that the milk was contaminated before it even left the cow. The lack of pasteurization meant that milk was a particularly effective vector for transmitting diseases. Tuberculosis, brucellosis, and numerous other infections were regularly transmitted through contaminated dairy products. Yet milk was considered essential for children and the sick, leading to a tragic situation where the foods people thought were healthiest were actually the most dangerous. Cheese and butter production took place in the same contaminated environments as milk production, but with the added factor of time. These products would age in cellars and storage areas that were often flooded with sewage during heavy rains. The aging process would occur in conditions that were ideal for bacterial growth, producing dairy products that were essentially concentrated disease cultures. Vegetables and fruits were grown in soil that had been fertilized with human waste. Following the logical but horrifying practice, of returning waste to the land. This created produce that was contaminated from the inside out, with disease organisms actually growing within the fruits and vegetables themselves. Washing these foods was pointless when the wash water came from the same contaminated sources as everything else. Market gardens were often located in areas where the soil had been enriched with decades of accumulated human and animal waste. The farmers who worked these gardens would walk through sewage-soaked fields, handling crops with hands that were permanently contaminated and delivering produce that carried the diseases of the entire city. The spice trade, which was enormously important in medieval times, added another layer of contamination to London's food supply. Spices were stored in warehouses located along the Thames, where they would be exposed to the humid, contaminated air and the occasional flooding from the sewage-filled river. Rats and other vermin would nest in the spice stores, contributing their own contamination to products that were supposed to preserve and flavour food. Food preparation in people's homes was no better than the commercial food supply. Cooking was done over fires that burned contaminated fuel, in pots that were rarely properly cleaned, with water that came from the Thames. Kitchen areas were located in the same rooms where people slept, worked, and relieved themselves, ensuring that every meal was prepared in a contaminated environment. The lack of proper food storage meant that families would often eat partially spoiled food simply because they couldn't afford to throw it away. Bread would develop mold, meat would begin to rot, and dairy products would sour, but people would continue eating these foods because the alternative was starvation. Food preservation techniques, while ingenious, often made contamination worse rather than better. Salting meat and fish required enormous quantities of salt, which was often contaminated with various impurities. The salt itself would be stored in damp, dirty conditions, where it would absorb toxins from the environment. Smoking foods required burning organic matter, which would add its own contamination to the preservation process. Even the wealthy couldn't entirely escape food contamination, though they had some advantages. They could afford to buy fresher foods, to employ servants who specialised in food preparation, and to maintain cleaner kitchens in their homes. But even wealthy households drew their water from contaminated sources, bought their food from the same contaminated markets, and breathed the same poisoned air that affected food preparation throughout the city. The cumulative effect of eating contaminated food every day was devastating. Chronic diarrhea, food poisoning, and stomach ailments were so common that they were considered normal parts of life. People expected to feel sick after eating, and they had no understanding that their food was the source of their constant illness. Children were particularly vulnerable to foodborne diseases. Their developing immune systems couldn't handle the constant assault of disease organisms, and many children died from what we would now recognise as preventable food poisoning. The high infant mortality rate in medieval London was largely due to the impossibility of maintaining clean food for the most vulnerable members of society. Perhaps most tragically, people had no concept of what safe food should look like, taste like, or smell like. They had never experienced truly fresh, clean food, so they had no standard for comparison. To them, food that was mildly contaminated, slightly spoiled or moderately toxic was simply normal food. The psychological impact of constantly eating unsafe food created a population that lived in a state of chronic low-level illness. People accepted feeling sick as normal, and they developed a tolerance for food poisoning that would be remarkable if it weren't so heartbreaking. Modern food safety standards would have been incomprehensible to medieval Londoners. The idea that food should be prepared in clean environments, that water should be safe to drink, or that meat should be fresh rather than decomposing would have seemed like impossible luxuries rather than basic necessities. The feast of flies that was medieval London's food supply represented one of the most complete failures of urban planning in human history. A city had grown beyond its ability to feed its population safely, creating conditions where simply eating became a life-threatening activity. Yet people continued to eat, to live, and to somehow survive in conditions that would kill modern people within days. After walking through the sewage-filled streets, breathing the toxic air, drinking poisoned water, and eating contaminated food, you might wonder how anyone survived in medieval London at all. The answer is both simple and horrifying. Most people didn't survive very long. Medieval London was essentially a vast laboratory for every disease known to humanity, plus quite a few that existed nowhere else on Earth. The mortality statistics for medieval London are staggering even by medieval standards. Life expectancy in the city was significantly lower than in rural areas, despite the supposed advantages of urban life, like access to trade, crafts, and services, while a peasant in the countryside might live to see 40 or even 50 years of age. A Londoner was lucky to reach 35. The city was such an effective killer that it couldn't maintain its population through natural increase. It survived only because desperate people from the countryside continuously moved to the city to replace those who had died. Infant mortality in London was catastrophic beyond modern comprehension. Historians estimate that between 40 to 60% of children died before their 5th birthday, with many of these deaths occurring in the first year of life. Children born in London faced immediate exposure to every contamination source the city had to offer. Contaminated water that would cause deadly diarrhea within hours of consumption, polluted air that would damage their developing lungs, filthy living conditions that exposed them to countless parasites and infections, and diseased parents who had already been weakened by years of urban life. The process of childbirth itself was extraordinarily dangerous in medieval London. Midwives, no matter how skilled, had to work in contaminated environments with contaminated tools and contaminated water. The birthing process would take place in rooms that had never been properly cleaned, often the same rooms where the family cooked, slept, and relieved themselves. The mortality rate for women in childbirth was astronomical, and those who survived often faced infections that would kill them weeks or months later. Newborn babies who survived the birth process faced immediate challenges that would seem insurmountable to modern parents. They would be washed in contaminated water, wrapped in cloth that had been cleaned in the Thames, and fed milk from mothers who were themselves malnourished and diseased. The very act of caring for a baby, feeding, cleaning, comforting, involved exposing the child to countless sources of infection. The diseases that thrived in medieval London were a catalogue of every way that filth and contamination can kill human beings. Waterborne diseases like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery spread through the contaminated water supply with devastating efficiency. These diseases were particularly terrifying because they struck without warning. People could wake up healthy in the morning and be dead by evening, their bodies racked by violent diarrhea and dehydration that would literally drain the life out of them within hours. Cholera was perhaps the most feared of the waterborne diseases. It would sweep through neighborhoods like wildfire, killing entire families within days. The disease caused such severe dehydration that victims would literally shrivel up before their families' eyes, their skin turning blue-grey as their bodies lost the ability to maintain basic functions. The speed of death from cholera was so shocking that people often thought it was caused by evil spirits or divine punishment rather than contaminated water. Typhoid fever was another waterborne killer that thrived in London's toxic environment. This disease would cause high fevers, delirium, and often death within weeks of infection. Unlike cholera's quick kill, typhoid was a slow torture that would waste its victims away gradually, causing weeks of suffering before finally releasing them through death. Dysentery, while less dramatic than cholera or typhoid, was perhaps even more insidious because it was so common. Most Londoners suffered from chronic dysentery, experiencing constant diarrhea, stomach pain, and weakness that would last for months or even years. This chronic condition would weaken people's immune systems, making them vulnerable to other diseases, and generally reducing their quality of life to a level that would be considered torture by modern standards. Respiratory diseases flourished in the toxic air of the city like nowhere else in medieval Europe. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, and various lung infections were endemic, spread both by the contaminated air and by the close quarters in which people lived. The chronic respiratory damage caused by breathing poisoned air made people especially vulnerable to these infections, creating a population with permanently compromised immune systems. Tuberculosis was particularly devastating because it was a slow killer that could spread through entire households before anyone realized what was happening. The disease would cause victims to cough up blood, waste away to skeletal thinness, and often linger for months or years before finally dying. The prolonged nature of tuberculosis meant that infected individuals would spread the disease to numerous other people before succumbing, creating chains of infection that could devastate entire neighborhoods. Pneumonia, while faster acting than tuberculosis, was equally deadly in London's environment. The combination of weakened lungs from breathing toxic air and exposure to bacterial infections created perfect conditions for pneumonia to develop and spread. The disease would fill victims' lungs with fluid, essentially drowning them from the inside while they struggled to breathe the already poisoned air of the city. Skin diseases were universal in medieval London, affecting every single resident regardless of age, gender, or social class. The constant contact with filth, combined with the impossibility of maintaining any semblance of personal hygiene, created ideal conditions for every kind of skin infection imaginable. Boils, abscesses, rashes, and various bacterial infections covered people's bodies like living landscapes of disease. These skin conditions weren't just cosmetic problems, they were sources of constant pain and additional vectors for disease transmission. Open sores would become infected with the bacteria that thrived in London's filthy environment, often leading to blood poisoning that could kill otherwise healthy individuals. The inability to keep wounds clean meant that even minor cuts or scrapes could become life-threatening infections. Scabies was so common in London that it was considered a normal part of life rather than a disease. The mites that caused scabies would burrow under people's skin, causing intense itching and creating open wounds that would become infected with other bacteria. Entire families would pass scabies back and forth, creating a cycle of infection that could last for generations. Parasitic infections were perhaps the most ubiquitous health problem in the city, affecting virtually every resident from birth to death. Intestinal worms were so common that they were considered normal. People expected to have worms and simply lived with the constant malnutrition and discomfort they caused. Roundworms, tapeworms, and various other parasites would live in people's digestive systems, stealing nutrients and causing chronic weakness that would last for decades. The process of becoming infected with intestinal parasites was almost inevitable in medieval London. The contaminated water supply, the filthy food preparation areas, and the general lack of hygiene meant that parasite eggs were constantly being ingested by the city's residents. Children were particularly vulnerable, and many would die from malnutrition caused by parasites stealing the nutrients from their already inadequate diets. External parasites were equally problematic. Lice, fleas, and other blood-sucking insects infested everyone, regardless of social class, spreading typhus and other diseases as they fed on their human hosts. The inability to maintain clean clothing or bedding meant that these parasites could establish permanent colonies on people's bodies, feeding continuously and reproducing rapidly. Fleas were particularly dangerous because they served as vectors for the bubonic plague, which would periodically sweep through London with devastating effect. But even when they weren't spreading plague, fleas caused constant discomfort and blood loss that would weaken their hosts and make them more vulnerable to other diseases. The plague, when it arrived in London in 1348, found conditions that were absolutely perfect for its spread. The city's enormous rat population thrived in the garbage-filled streets, living in the accumulated waste and reproducing rapidly in the ideal conditions that London's filth provided. The fleas that carried the plague bacteria had unlimited hosts among both rats and humans, and the general poor health of the population made them especially vulnerable to the disease. The Black Death killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of London's population within just 2 years. But this massive die-off was possible only because the city had created conditions that were perfect for disease transmission. The overcrowding, the filth, the contaminated water and food supplies, and the generally weakened state of the population all contributed to making the plague more deadly in London than in almost any other city in Europe. But the plague was just the most famous of London's diseases. The city was also home to smallpox, measles, influenza, various forms of fever, and numerous diseases that no longer exist because they required the specific conditions of medieval urban filth to survive. Some of these diseases were unique to London, having evolved in the city's particular combination of contamination sources and environmental factors. Smallpox was particularly devastating to children, causing high fevers and characteristic pustules that would cover the victim's entire body. The disease would often leave survivors permanently scarred and sometimes blind, creating a population marked by the physical evidence of their struggles against disease. Measles, while often considered a childhood disease, was deadly in the malnourished and weakened population of medieval London. The disease would cause high fevers, rashes, and often complications that would lead to death, particularly among children who were already struggling with malnutrition and other health problems. Various forms of fever, some identifiable as specific diseases we know today, others mysterious illnesses that defied medieval understanding, would sweep through the city periodically, killing hundreds or thousands before mysteriously disappearing. These epidemic diseases were often attributed to divine punishment or malevolent spirits, as medieval medicine had no understanding of bacterial or viral infection. The medical response to this disease environment was tragically inadequate and often counterproductive. Medieval medicine had no understanding of bacterial infection, viral transmission, or the role of contamination in causing disease. Doctors, trained in university systems that emphasized ancient texts over practical observation, would prescribe treatments that often made patients worse rather than better. Bloodletting was one of the most common medical treatments, based on the theory that disease was caused by an imbalance of bodily humours that could be corrected by draining blood from the patient. This practice was particularly dangerous for people who were already weakened by malnutrition and disease, as it would further reduce their strength and ability to fight off infections. Purging, the use of powerful laxatives to empty the patient's digestive system, was another common treatment that often proved fatal. Patients who were already suffering from diarrhea and dehydration would be given substances that would worsen these symptoms, often leading to fatal dehydration. Medical practitioners would also prescribe various herbal remedies and potions that were prepared in the same contaminated environments as everything else in the city. These medicines were often more dangerous than helpful, as they would introduce additional bacteria and toxins into patients who were already fighting for their lives. The few hospitals that existed in London were often more dangerous than staying home. These institutions, usually run by religious orders, lacked any understanding of hygiene or disease transmission. Patients with different diseases would be placed in the same beds. Medical instruments were never sterilized, and the hospital environments were often filthier than the streets outside. Hospitals would often become concentrated sources of infection where people went to die rather than to recover. The practice of placing multiple patients in the same bed meant that diseases would spread rapidly through the hospital population, and the high mortality rate in these institutions gave them a reputation as places of death rather than healing. Religious authorities interpreted the constant disease and death as divine punishment for the city's sins, leading to responses that were spiritual rather than practical. They organized prayer services, religious processions, and various forms of penance designed to appease God's wrath and end the suffering. These religious responses, while providing some psychological comfort to the population, had no effect on the actual causes of disease. In some cases, religious gatherings actually made disease transmission worse by bringing infected people together in confined spaces. Churches and religious processions would become super spreader events, allowing diseases to jump between families and neighbourhoods that might otherwise have remained isolated from each other. The wealthy had some advantages in dealing with London's disease environment, but these were often more psychological than practical. They could afford to employ physicians, though medieval medicine was often counterproductive, regardless of who could afford it. They could live in slightly larger homes with better ventilation, though no part of London was truly clean or safe. Most importantly, wealthy families could afford to leave the city during plague outbreaks and other health emergencies. They could retreat to country estates where the air was cleaner and the water was less contaminated, waiting out the worst of the epidemic diseases before returning to the city. But even wealthy Londoners couldn't entirely escape the city's toxic environment. They breathed the same air, drew water from the same contaminated sources, and lived in the same overall environment as everyone else. Wealth could provide some protection and some options for escape, but it couldn't create a bubble of health in the midst of such comprehensive contamination. The poor, who made up the vast majority of London's population, had no protection whatsoever against the disease environment. They lived in the most contaminated areas of the city, often in cellars that flooded with sewage during heavy rains. They worked in the most dangerous conditions, handling contaminated materials and breathing the most toxic air. They ate the most contaminated food and had no access to even the inadequate medical care that was available to the wealthy. Perhaps most tragically, the people who were most vulnerable to disease: children, the elderly, pregnant women, and the already sick, received the least protection from London's toxic environment. Children played in the filthiest areas of the city, building their games around piles of waste and contaminated water. Elderly people, weakened by decades of exposure to London's toxins, couldn't escape contaminated environments even when they knew they were dangerous. Pregnant women had no access to clean food or water during the critical months when they were nurturing new life, and sick people were often abandoned by their families because caring for them was seen as too dangerous for the healthy members of the household. The psychological impact of living in constant proximity to death and disease was profound and lasting. People developed a fatalistic attitude toward illness and mortality, accepting that most children would die young, that adults would be frequently sick, and that death could come at any moment without warning. This acceptance was probably psychologically necessary for survival, but it also prevented people from taking action to improve their conditions. Social relationships were constantly affected by the threat of disease. People became suspicious of strangers who might be carrying infections. Families would abandon sick members to protect the healthy, and entire neighbourhoods would be shunned if disease broke out there. The bonds that normally held communities together were constantly strained by the fear of contagion and the reality of death. The economic impact of constant disease was devastating to both individuals and the city as a whole. Sick people couldn't work, reducing their families' income and their ability to afford food and shelter. Dead people couldn't contribute to their families' survival, often leaving widows and orphans to fend for themselves in an environment that was hostile to the weak and vulnerable. The constant need to care for the sick drained resources that could have been used for other purposes, and the high mortality rate meant that investments in training and education were often lost when skilled workers died young. London's economy was essentially built on the assumption that a large percentage of the population would be sick or dead at any given time. Perhaps most remarkably, people continued to have families, build businesses, create art, and pursue happiness despite living in conditions that were fundamentally hostile to human life. The human capacity to find meaning and joy, even in the most horrific circumstances, is demonstrated by the fact that London continued to grow and thrive Despite being one of the most dangerous places on Earth, love still bloomed in the filthy streets of medieval London. Couples would court and marry despite knowing that their children would likely die young and that they themselves might not live to see old age together. Artists would create beautiful works despite breathing air that damaged their lungs and living in conditions that would seem to preclude any beauty or creativity. Merchants would build successful businesses despite the constant threat of disease and death. And scholars would pursue learning despite the challenges of maintaining books and writing materials in such a contaminated environment. The human spirit's refusal to be crushed by even the most horrific circumstances is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of medieval London's story. Modern people visiting medieval London would likely become seriously ill within hours of arrival. The shock to immune systems accustomed to relatively clean environments would be overwhelming, and diseases that medieval Londoners had some resistance to would be devastating to modern visitors. The combination of waterborne illnesses, respiratory infections, and parasitic diseases would likely prove fatal to anyone without the lifetime of exposure that gave medieval Londoners their limited resistance. Yet somehow, the city survived and even thrived. People continued to come to London seeking opportunities, and some of them even found success despite the horrific conditions. The city became a centre of trade, learning and culture, proving that human civilization can flourish even in environments that are fundamentally toxic to human health. London's merchants traded with the far corners of the known world. Its craftsmen created goods that were prized throughout Europe, and its scholars contributed to the advancement of knowledge, despite working in conditions that would seem to preclude intellectual achievement. The city's very existence was a testament to human determination and adaptability. The story of medieval London is ultimately a story about human resilience and adaptation, but also about the terrible price of that adaptation. The people who lived in medieval London paid for their city's growth and importance with their health, their comfort, and often their lives. They normalized conditions that were genuinely horrific, accepting suffering that was entirely preventable because they had no conception that life could be different. Their legacy is complex. They built one of Europe's great cities and created a centre of commerce and culture that would influence the development of the entire continent. But they also created a model of urban development that prioritised growth and economic opportunity over human health and well-being. A model whose consequences would echo through centuries of urban planning. As you imagine yourself standing in medieval London, surrounded by the reek of human waste, breathing air thick with toxic smoke, drinking water that tastes of sewage, and eating food crawling with flies, remember that this was home to nearly 100,000 people who somehow found ways to live meaningful lives in the midst of unimaginable filth. Their story is both inspiring and heartbreaking, a testament to human adaptability and a reminder of how much we've gained through centuries of progress in sanitation, medicine, and urban planning. Medieval London was hell on earth, but it was also undeniably human, built by people who refused to give up hope despite living in conditions that would defeat most of us today. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your clean bed, breathing fresh air, and confident that your water is safe to drink, perhaps you'll spare a thought for the countless souls who made the best of medieval London's horrific conditions. They lived in hell, but they were undeniably human, and their story deserves to be remembered, if only to help us appreciate how far we've come.